We're so happy you could join us. My name is Jenny Rose Halprin, and I am the Executive Director of Library Futures. Before we get started, I wanted to introduce Library Futures and our work, as well as introduce you to our illustrious panel and set some expectations for our discussion today. We'll be monitoring the chat in YouTube so that the event can continue to be interactive. So definitely chime in, introduce yourself, and express yourself throughout. We'll also be collecting questions for all of you for a Q&A at the end. Our chat moderator is Library Futures board member, Tucky Taylor. So if you need anything, just ping her. Library Futures supports all community members. Any user behaving in an inappropriate manner on the stream will be blocked at our sole discretion. The internet may sometimes feel diffuse, but it is the place where we are gathering. Life is with other people, so please treat others like people, which is a good maxim to keep in mind, both on the internet and off. So who are we? Library Futures is a new nonprofit organization that champions the right to equitable access to knowledge. Our mission is to build a coalition and community that empowers libraries to take control of their digital futures. We enable collective action while building power through an advocacy organization. We respond to 21st century needs, operate at the speed of change, and level the playing field between publishers and the public. We empower libraries to fulfill their mission and provide non-discriminatory open access to culture for the public good. And we'd love to have you as part of our community. Tucky will drop our website in the chat at libraryfutures.net so you can find out how you can get involved. Either as a donor, we are a nonprofit after all, a coalition member, or by spreading the word about our work and advocacy around these issues. We look forward to being in touch. And who better to kick off our first events, or one of our first events, as an organization than some of the leading experts on libraries, technology, and the law. Kyle K. Courtney, Meredith Rose, Jason Schultz, and Aaron Perzanowski. Jason M. Schultz is a professor of clinical law, director of NYU's Technology, Law, and Policy Clinic, and co-director of the Engelberg Center on Innovation Law and Policy. His clinical projects, research, and writing primarily focus on practical frameworks and policy options to help traditional areas of law, such as intellectual property, privacy, consumer protection, and civil rights adapt in light of new technologies and the challenges they pose. Meredith Rose is Senior Policy Counsel at Public Knowledge, where she specializes in copyright policy with a focus on music licensing, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, digital lending, and user speech online. She is also a professional lecturer on law at George Washington University, where she advises the student-run Federal Communications Law Journal. Aaron Perzanowski is professor of law and Oliver C. Schroeder Jr. Distinguished Research Scholar at Case Western Reserve University, where he teaches copyright, trademark, and property law. His research on the intersection of intellectual and personal property explores the notion of ownership in a digital economy. His work on IP and social norms considers how informal governance influences creative production. Kyle K. Courtney is a lawyer and librarian dedicated to issues surrounding copyright, access, and preservation. He serves as copyright advisor and program manager at the Harvard Library Office for Scholarly Communication. He co-founded Fair Use Week, which is this week, and is now an international celebration sponsored annually by over 100 universities, libraries, and other institutions. He is also the chair of the board of Library Futures. So I know you all have a lot to talk about, but I was wondering if I could seed the discussion and ask if Aaron and Jason could get us kicked off by discussing both the legal and the social precedents for the licensing of digital goods, as well as the confusing and inconsistent decisions over time from Betamax to Redigi and beyond. I'd love if you could kind of address the question of how we got here. And Kyle and Meredith, could you follow up by discussing how and why these legal and social precedents and decisions impact libraries and the public sector?
So I'll jump in if that's all right. First of all, thanks so much for organizing this and for inviting us. This is great. I'm so excited to be able to participate in this great event today. So, I think at the core of the work that Jason and I have done is sort of a recognition of a kind of inherent tension between intellectual property and personal property, right? So IP, and here we're primarily going to be talking about copyright law, gives owners the right to control the use and to some extent the distribution of intangible works. But historically, those works all took some physical form, right? A hardcover book, a vinyl record, a video game cartridge. And when those objects were sold to consumers, they rightly expected to have rights over their personal property. And the way the law historically has kind of resolved that conflict between IP and personal property was this principle of exhaustion, what we call the first sale doctrine in copyright law, right? The idea that once a rights holder sells a copy, they lose the right to control, how it's used, whether it's sold, loaned, given away. And that approach worked pretty well for a couple of hundred years, right? In US law, this notion in copyright and in patent law kind of dates back to the mid 19th century. Copyright holders have been resistant to this principle for a long time and have tried over the years various ways of undermining that rule. That's true for book publishers, record labels, movie studios, video game companies, and mostly they failed. But I think two things have happened that really kind of disrupted this equilibrium. First, the software industry succeeded in convincing courts of the idea of a license, not a license to an intangible work, but a license to a particular copy. We think that's pretty much a legally incoherent idea, but courts bought into it. And that's made a big difference. And we can talk a little bit more about some of the cases that led us in that direction and why it might be time to rethink them. The other thing that's happened is we've seen this shift in the market away from tangible media, first to downloads and now to sort of streaming and subscription models. So I think that's how we kind of ended up in the world that we're in today, one that's really kind of defined by contingent, conditional rights of access rather than a more kind of robust and stable form of ownership. So that's I think kind of the big picture overview.
Sure, and let me just jump in on that. So yeah, the other thing that's been really interesting in how the laws evolved, right? So for hundreds of years in Anglo-American law, you had this kind of distinction, as Aaron was talking about, between intellectual property and personal property. And then personal property, had its own area of law that was evolving over time, where as powerful entities or individuals would try to attach conditions to things, even way before anything digital, they were called servitudes, right? Or, and they would say, well, you can have this, cart, but you have to, only drive it on these roads, or this piece of land has these conditions on it, or other things. And courts got really annoyed at this for various reasons, probably because other powerful people were annoyed. And there was this sort of understanding that if you're going to really sell something and someone's going to own something, you can't attach too many restrictions on it. You can't sort of like have your hooks in it, tether it, because otherwise, how does that object travel through commerce? How does it get resold? How do people get to develop it and make it their own thing? And there's a sense of like you don't really own it, and that actually existed for hundreds of years. And that really set up this notion that when you bought something that embodied as a physical copy an intellectual work, that you still had this sense that you couldn't restrict it, and courts were sort of buying into that. And as Aaron mentioned, there's been this sort of evolution of thinking, and that's really what's put us in this kind of vague place. And in particular, the way it formed, and Aaron and I read about some of the history of this, as a sort of common law notion in the courts, it when it got written into the copyright statute, which I'm sure most of you may have already known, and we're probably among a group of people who have actually read section 107 and 109 of the Copyright Act more than anyone else in the world. There is this focus on ownership of a particular copy, right? That was the sort of phrase. Now, we believe that's not the only part of the first sale or exhaustion doctrine, as we talk about it, that enables this kind of ownership model to exist. But those were the words that were put into the statute, right? And as Aaron was referencing, what's become tricky is that questions of, what is a copy have become technologically and culturally very fuzzy in a lot of places, right? And what is a particular copy has also become fuzzy in a bunch of places. As we distribute things across devices, and it used to be that you had physical media, right, like a diskette or something, or even a USB drive that would embody this idea of a particular copy. We still believe particular copies exist, but those of you who follow cases like the Redigi case and other of these kind of cases see that sort of the struggle with modernizing this idea of what you own has become more challenging for everyone. I think, realistically, to define in a way that separates out what you own from what the intellectual property owner thinks they own. And we see this also in the rulemaking proceeding in front of the Copyright Office for Section 1201 around DRM, and we can talk more about DRM as well. But DRM has also made this very complicated about, do I own a particular copy? The other thing is that this idea, and we use this first sale doctrine as a kind of catch-all in some ways for what happens when the intellectual property owner distributes or disposes a particular copy to you as a library or as a human. And the question of what is distribution or disposition of a copy is also sort of come into question as well, right? Because of internet architectures and all these other things. So just to flag that the kind of evolution of technology, with the evolution of law, with things like EULAs in terms of service and licensing practices, and just the way that we organize our information around books and other things at libraries and archives have been a huge, part of curating and preserving and distributing has brought on these challenges. And that's kind of where I think we are.
I can jump in at the tail end of that. So I think, to sort of build out a little bit, speaking from the consumer perspective, one of the things that you notice from a historical trajectory the sort of fundamental premise of copyright law, as both Aaron and Jason pointed out, is this idea of physical copies. This was a system that was designed all the way back during the Statute of Anne, having to do with printers' guilds. It deals with physical books. It deals with physical objects. The invention of digital is a very, very recent thing. And up until very comparatively recently, you didn't have this issue where reproduction could, in theory, happen relatively frictionless manner and at scale. And so you have a system which is continually duct taped onto its earlier self. So that's the primary MO of copyright lawmaking, is we take the existing system and rather than overhauling it, we just kind of slap some new rights or controls on top of it. Then you enter computer code, and that's when that MO goes into overdrive. So essentially, courts and lawmakers and the Copyright Office were confounded by this problem of, well, what is a physical copy for the purposes of software? How do we create a legal fiction that there is a physical copy involved, not even just in software? You can think of a floppy disk, you can think of a CD. We're actually going all the way back to the 1960s for some of this stuff, so predating even that. But what is the physical copy of a program as it is being executed internally within a computer? How do we deal with that? How do we deal with bits and bytes of electricity? And what do we pretend is the physical copy here for the purposes of keeping our sanity? And the answer basically was that we treat the micron of hard disk space, which is currently being activated by the software, more or less, as being the physical copy. And so the upshot of that is whenever you defrag your hard drive, you're actually physically, if you're a supercomputer nerd, you're physically moving these little microns from one point to another, which, as far as copyright law is concerned, you are now creating new copies of the program by putting it in new places. And so this throws a monkey wrench in all kinds of things when you try to apply traditional parts of copyright law that seem pretty common sense, and you try to shoehorn them into a digital context. So that's anybody who's followed the Redigi case. It had to do with, why can't I basically resell or loan my MP3 collection? This is a question people have been asking, and other folks have been trying to solve for a couple decades at this point. And the short answer is because we have this unworkable legal fiction that even if you move a file, you create a copy of a file from point A to point B, and you delete the copy at point A, still technically under the law, you've made a new copy. And so that's like Xeroxing a novel is the closest analogy that courts can really get their heads around. So it ends up with these totally counterintuitive internal non sequiturs about what is actually going on. And so you end up with this problem of, we have to copy and move things around our hard drive all the time. The computers do it automatically. You have, RAM copies of a program when you're running it. Like I've got another copy of Zoom running right now just to have this conversation. And some of these things have been dealt with more adequately than others. And so this really starts making problems for customers because now, on top of all of this other legal confusion, it becomes a practical matter because pretty much everything we own nowadays has software embedded in it, all the way up to and including your car, your television. God forbid you have, an Amazon Alexa. And all of that is either enabled by software at its core functionality, or just incidentally happens to have software running on it. Because you don't own that software in the traditional legal sense, you are very limited in what you can do with the object that is carrying it. If I try to resell an Amazon Echo, I can't technically resell the software that's in it. So what can I resell? I can sell a piece of plastic that doesn't really do anything. It also runs into problems like we see with right to repair. If you can't access the inner guts of your tractor to repair the tractor when it breaks down in the field, what do you do? The answer, according to John Deere, is you get on a wait list, at some point in the harvest season, and your potatoes rot in the ground, and too bad, so sad. So you run into this a lot, and God forbid you also run into it with things like medical devices. Pacemakers have software in them. Glucose monitors have software in them. I have a 4-year-old and a forthcoming second child, and the sheer volume of software-enabled stuff is like slightly terrifying. Baby monitors, everything. So this is becoming a ubiquitous problem and one that is very, very difficult to evade. And so as a consumer advocate, we've seen a lot of concern from lawmakers. With COVID, all of a sudden the right to repair becomes a huge issue with things like ventilators. What if you can't legally repair a ventilator because of copyright law for some reason? And we're in the middle of a global pandemic. So it's a pervasive problem that is, in large part attributable to this historic inclination to not really upset the apple cart too much with copyright law. And instead we'll just keep strapping stuff onto it, and hopefully something resembling sanity might eventually come out.
Man, I have a lot to build off of there. I'm going to land this plane for cultural institutions, archives, and libraries. So there was a lot of great stuff there. Thank you, Meredith. Let me start off with, I love phrases like thinks they own it, because we deal like what does ownership mean? I love that. And the idea of the legal fiction, I'm behind all of that 100%. But let's look at how libraries do not like limitations like this, and we certainly do not like, and why is that? And that's because the fundamental notion of a cultural institution being able to preserve and save and loan and share is subject to a bunch of other exceptions that existed that said, oh, libraries' missions may be particularly special, right? And the limitations Congress enacted in 107 fair use, 108 for libraries and archives, 109 for sale, libraries and cultural institutions like to think that that's kind of our space to live in too, because of our mission, right? And they help define the ambit of the copyright holder's rights, which themselves exist subject to these other special things that we're talking about first sale here particularly. But, it gets back to the fundamental mission of, well, consumers can buy their stuff and people can have access continually, but how do libraries continue their mission in this space unimpeded by some of these problems? Because I remember after going to law school and library school, I'm like, what? How do libraries legally do what they do? And it's kind of this incredible thing, right? We're capable of buying and sharing. And that's because I think historically, and I think the end of ownership outlines this very well. The idea is that we're supposed to be able to purchase and share, right? That's how we're supposed to do that. The first sale access, notwithstanding this particular thing, we can, without the authority of the owner, loan, share, give away. And it's the secondary market, right? Libraries we are the secondary market. We're the living embodiment of it. And that concept is lost on most people if you just think, I go to the library, check out a book. Why is an ebook not the same? Why can't I do the same exact thing that I've always done, right? Why can't I get access to this? So I think, entire industries are built on this same enterprise, right? When first sale kind of took hold, libraries are permitted to loan stuff to patrons. And I use stuff in a vague term. It's not just books, right? There's all sorts of things. Use record stores, use CD stores. eBay relies on this provision, right? It lets people sell stuff online. And not to harken back, because we said we might talk about some cases, but there's a case called Bobbs Merrill, right? And it said the destruction of the secondary market is super bad. In fact, they said it's hateful from the law in Lord Coke's day to ours because it's obnoxious to the public interest. And so I think about kind of some of these software-oriented mission-based licensing applying to our books, our collections that have significant legal and fiscal value to these communities in which these public libraries exist. It is obnoxious to the public interest that we can't get this. And I think obviously the pandemic exemplified this even better when we had closures. And the answer wasn't, all right, let's figure out how to make these digitally available. The answer that I heard from some parts of the copyright space was, oh, well, I have to get more licenses in order to then be able to loan these collections to people. And I think to myself, and I think a lot of us fellow cultural institution professionals are like, wait, I have to buy everything again under a restrictive license that prevents me from doing my mission, that doesn't let me, I don't know, loan, interlibrary loan, make a fair use of, share. And I think that's where kind of that frustration comes in, right? Electronic works are typically sold to agreements that look a less like sale and a lot like a limited license. And those have that impact on this. So consumers can get on board with us. Libraries can agree that this legal fiction needs to end to a certain extent. But of course, I'm totally biased. I think it needs to end with regards to libraries' mission in making stuff continually available to those for so many purposes: socioeconomic, access, right to receive materials, education, general research, learning, literacy. So I think those are priority-based missions that we may have in our wheelhouse that can help, I guess, take away the fiction in this legal fiction that we outlined.
Yeah, if I could just add one quick thing to that, which is, and this is just to bolster the sort of aspect of the library and all the other cultural institutions, archives, or museums, I mean, so many places, right? All the empirical research on how copyright owners behave, even with great intentions, pretty much reinforces the notion that they're short-term thinkers, most of them, right? We have questions of orphan works and long tails and all this stuff, but like, especially profit-driven publishers, they're focused on the next quarter, maybe the next year. Some of them do think beyond that, but really, and copyright as it's structured, let's not even get into the term of it and all this stuff, right? But like in general, it's trying to create incentives that are mapped to those short-term goals, right? It's like, make this thing, make it soon, get it out there, and then your job's done, right? Kind of in a way, right? And you might do other things, like you might license it, you might derivative works, etc. But then it, there is the space for preservation, there's a space for other things that might happen, right? And so one of the things that all of these changes in digital ownership make difficult. We've mentioned this, Meredith mentioned this with the Alexa example, but we've seen this all over the place, is like the maintenance and the kind of understanding of how these things continue to exist for years and decades and centuries is something that most copyright owners aren't interested in, don't think about. In fact, obsolescence is often a model, right? So I just wanted to double down and say that when we talk about things like DRM and things like the 1201 proceeding, which is can you get access to something that you bought to do something with it? Can you repair it? Can you preserve it? Can you change it to a different device? All these, can you jailbreak your phone? Those are all part of also, I think, a kind of policy that is important in terms of preservation and ongoing value. I just wanted to connect those dots too, because it really is that the copyright creator publisher model is a short-term model for most entities and people. They want to continue to exist, but per work, it's a short-term thinking model for most of them.
And because we're talking about cultural institutions today in particular, and it is Fair Use Week, I'm wondering if you could touch on how fair use might start to solve some of these problems, in particular for cultural institutions.
So I can jump in here and maybe do a little bit of framing that might tee up a sort of more direct answer to that question. So like we talked a little bit already about the Redigi case. And I think it's useful to think about the way the legal arguments worked in that case to give us some insight on kind of what the future of this question looks like, right? So Redigi creates this marketplace for used MP3s, and part of their argument relies on the first sale doctrine, right? But the court there says, looking at section 109, that the first sale doctrine is limited to the distribution of copies and can't be extended to the reproduction of copies. Now, Jason and I have argued that if you actually look at the original, some of the older kind of pre-Bobbs Merrill exhaustion cases, that's actually like too limited of a reading of the rule, but we can kind of put that aside for the moment. Distributing digital works entails the creation of copies, almost, by definition. Redigi tried, and at least according to the Second Circuit, failed to kind of engineer around that problem, right? So if you need to make copies in order to facilitate otherwise lawful distribution or otherwise lawful transfer of a copy that you own, I think fair use might be able to sort of fill that gap. But we've got to reconcile that idea with the fact that Redigi lost their fair use argument as well, right? Why? Well, Judge Laval said that making exact copies of songs for resale wasn't transformative. Now, maybe that's true, maybe it's not. Who am I to question Judge Laval on what transformation looks like? Well, I think there's a case to be made here that those copies are being used in a way for a kind of crucially different purpose, right? They're being created precisely because they're necessary to facilitate this lawful transfer of ownership, right? And we've seen courts, plenty of courts, open to the idea that sort of intermediate copies that are necessary to serve some other lawful purpose fall within the scope of fair use. The other thing that goes wrong for Redigi in that case is under the fourth factor, when the court's thinking about market harm. The court points out that Redigi is directly competing with copyright holders in the sale of these recordings. Yeah, they are. That's exactly the kind of competition that the first sale doctrine is supposed to encourage. That's what used record stores do. That's what used bookstores do, right? They introduce lower priced means of acquiring copies, and they put downward pressure on new copies. And generally, we think that's a good thing. It's important, though, to keep in mind here that fair use, of course, is this very fact-intensive sort of inquiry. I think if you have a different defendant, that case might look very different. I think if you have some different technology, that case might look very different. And so I think it's useful to keep this particular decision in mind when we're trying to think about how a similar kind of legal argument might apply, for example, to a library, which I imagine other folks have things that they'd like to say about that.
I just want to quickly acknowledge, though, that in Europe, we've seen a few other decisions that, especially in the software context, where courts have acknowledged more like digital ownership could exist and especially if you bought software and then updates are being forced on you and things like that. So it is something that not all courts agree with Judge LaValle and Redigi straight up, although they don't have fair use there. So they've, depending on the jurisdiction you're in and things like that. So it's a complicated landscape outside the US as well. And I just wanted to acknowledge that. Also, the other thing, to give a quick shout out to Jonathan Ban. He did write a very good article about thinking about how fair use could apply when you're close to first sale, but not quite there under the statute.
So I'll be the one to mention controlled digital lending, because why not? And this is the concept that's been outlined to kind of attempt to read through what Aaron was outlining with the Redigi decision. Imagine for a moment there was a nonprofit educational marketplace in which loaned digital copies of books to others that was not directly competing with the user, and I'd add asserts control over its collection. Right, that's one of the other differences I think with the Redigi case is that, like, I buy my MP3 subject to a license with iTunes. I really have no control over that in any stretch. Now, obviously, that gets us part of the way, and what I'm putting on when Dave Hansen and I wrote the white paper is I'm putting fair use through a first sale lens, and that's how I kind of describe this. Like, I'm looking through it, and it says, the powers that be that we get under the doctrine of first sale is transformative in its nature with regards to libraries and archives collections that they have acquired. Now, that's for stuff that's already on my shelves, right? I'm very excited about that. If we could harness that somehow without harming the market and again, discuss its transformativeness in the space that it has a Sony-like VCR style non-substantial infringing use, right? This is fair. This is clearly fair. Maybe we can get there. But what we're discussing here is also the current state of affairs with regards to the purchasing that's occurring at libraries and archives and museums, where we're buying stuff subject to license, much like the iTunes case, where I purchase things subject to license. And so I think some of the challenge is not only looking at the past and looking at what we have previously collected and preserving the legal, fiscal, and significant values that those have, but also the future. Will Cross out of North Carolina State University and I did a fun lecture called "What If Netflix Was Dead?" Which was basically, if they go belly up, have we been able to save all these films and these movies, et cetera? And no, because the license is, personal use only, no copies, definitely no library license, but things that are again impacting the library mission for the future. So for Fair Use Week, I like to think contract or license versus fair use is a distinct challenge, and people get confused. As we've seen, licensing, especially restrictive licensing that can prevent ownership, can have drastic results on the library's mission, but maybe we don't think of it as nullifying fair use. Imagine contract law and fair use as some kind of separate sources of authority, right? I can seek permission, a license, to use a work, or maybe I can exercise my own rights under the law if I have access to it. And there's the linchpin of why I don't think fair use gets us all the way there with regards to some of this. What if I can't even get my hands on it because I can't agree to a license to even do this? What if the purchase is, again, not a purchase? I'm renting all of my stuff. Maybe I can't really get access to it to then make my fair use of it, right? I'd have to acquire it and access it and put it somewhere to then make a fair use of it. So I think that's part of the problem with our future versions of how we're going to continue collection development and interlibrary loan and increasing access, research, and literacy for the public at large. If we can't even get the items, I think that's part of it.
So I know everyone wants to talk about DRM, which stands for Digital Rights Management, but I'm seeing a couple of questions on library lending rights and public lending rights in terms of the secondary library market. And I'm wondering if we can kind of loop these topics together and talking about the ways in which digital rights management or technological protection measures, which someone in the UK has asked about. If you can kind of address how DRM and the library's right to lend, as well as the ways in which copying and technological protections work within and can work within cultural heritage organizations and institutions, and also within libraries. Particularly in the context of CDL. Kyle, I think you're muted.
Was that my question? Sorry.
Oh, it would. No, I just saw your lips moving. So I was like, is this?
I said, woo, that's a big question
Yeah,
to
it is a big
myself
question.
just then. But I'm happy to yield if anyone wants to take a shot at this.
Jason and Aaron, oh, go ahead.
Meredith,
go ahead,
please.
Yeah.
Provide a little bit of historical context to tee this up, which, you know, following Aaron's lead here, which will hopefully make this a little less of a gigantic lift of a question that I spend 40 hours a week thinking about sometimes. So again, going back historically to the roots of copyright, I'm going to be the boring history professor for a second and grossly oversimplify in the process. But if you think about from an economic perspective, what it takes to produce a novel, for example, picking on them because, you know, novels, we've had them around for a long time. Think about the amount of effort it takes to produce a novel. And then over time, how the effort to reproduce that novel has declined. And it's become more and more frictionless to the point where the friction is almost zero now in a digital context. So copyright, even from its earliest days, has existed as a way to impose basically artificial scarcity on a cultural work, so that when someone has written Don Quixote, when Cervantes finished Don Quixote, it existed. It was out in the world. It was all it took was people to copy it. And so from an economic perspective, that could make it very difficult to recoup the value of the original production of the work. And so the idea behind this, and, you know, it cropped up among printers guilds, especially basically printers guilds would try to get the only right to reproduce a certain book so that they could sell it and then try to recoup the cost of paying the author and all this and sort of cyclical business models. So nowadays, it basically serves the same function. It's a way to impose artificial scarcity on something that could, in the absence of this, just be infinitely multiplied and distributed. And there's perfectly valid policy reasons to want to be able to do that. You know, you want to incentivize creation. People need to eat. They need to have a roof over their head. So there are valid reasons to do that. But DRM and TPM, for folks at home, DRM is digital rights management. TPM is technological protection measures. They're basically interchangeable for the purposes of this discussion. Those are a way to, in the digital context, create artificial scarcity when you could otherwise, at the push of a button, just multiply these things everywhere. So in that sense, you know, and their role is a very complicated question because copyright is not just novels anymore. There's 1.5 million things that fall into the ambit of copyright protection, whether they should or not. But I think we need to just sort of keep in mind that that's the animating principle behind their existence and the recognition of the law, is to just keep that, you know, to artificially in a digital context preserve the concept of you buy one book, you can loan one book. So I will just put that out there as context, and I can let with that little glide path, I can hand it off to Kyle or whoever wants to follow up.
So I would just add to that. You know, when we're thinking about DRM, the rules that DRM might impose on an institution or an individual are not necessarily and frequently are not the rules that the law imposes, right? DRM is about substituting the rules created by law with the preferences, hopes, wishes of copyright holders and device manufacturers, right? And it's also about kind of substituting the kind of inherent physical capabilities of a copy or a thing that we buy, you know, whether it's the ebook that you're reading or the car that you're driving, with these artificial limitations, right? And that, I think, is the crucial thing to understand about many, although not all, of the downsides of DRM. It is a form of private lawmaking that I think we ought to be really skeptical about, right? And so what laws like Section 1201 of the DMCA do is that they reinforce these private efforts to rewrite the law with the actual law, right? They create liability for circumventing these technological protection measures that are meant to enforce this sort of privately created code, right? I'll be upfront about kind of my preferences in this conversation. I think when it comes to any object or any scrap of code or any copyrighted work that is sold to a consumer or an institution, Section 1201 ought to be abolished. It ought to have nothing to do with what our rights are as individuals. Now, when you're talking about lending and rental models, that's an exception I'm willing to entertain because it's really difficult to see from an economic perspective how those models can survive in an environment in which copying happens without restriction. But if you're trying to tell me as an individual what I can do with the things that I purchase, I don't think DRM needs to be part of that conversation at all.
Yeah, if I could just add a couple of things too, and some folks asked with controlled digital lending, for example, on the sort of own to loan ratio of 1-to-1 and DRM and what are the roles of that. Here's the thing, like in fair use analysis, right, you have these 4 factors. The last factor is this question of, well, what happens to these markets for books or movies or whatever? Like, what is the impact economically here? I think for a very long time, there was a sort of intuitive sense or normative sense of like, okay, well, libraries are doing their thing over here, booksellers or whoever does their stuff over there. And libraries are being very careful to further their public interest social missions and try to minimize impact on that first sale for the publisher, right? There's obviously always some tension, people can go to the library instead of buying a book, but in general, it gets worked out and there's an equilibrium reached. And I think now what's happening, one of the things I'm excited about with CDL and some of these other aspects is it's saying, okay, well, we're acknowledging that there are new factors coming into play, but we're still trying to use the same values as libraries and cultural institutions, where we're trying to like give the original publisher their go, like you have it, great, got your first thing out there, and we're trying to do our thing over here. And it's a recognition that in some contexts, I mean, DRM is just technology, right? It can be used in a number of different ways. It can be used for imposing private law, or not even law, but like private will on consumers, which I think I agree with Aaron should be abolished. But it could also be used as a way to try to preserve the sort of equitable nature, the sort of fairness nature of like, look, we bought a book, we're just trying to make it available. It's a pandemic, come on. Like, let's just try to make this work for people who really need access to knowledge, information, and culture, right? And so I do want to acknowledge that it's not that all DRM is bad or can't be used, but it's like, can we create kind of more innovative ways to preserve this role that institutions have played, and a CDL a mechanism for doing that, and is fair use a legal way of thinking about it, right? Where when we really are trying to preserve the kind of balance, we have things that we can show people, like this is what we're doing to try to continue doing the good work that we've done. And so I just want to connect those things to the 4th factor of the fair use analysis in the US, because I do think it's important, not only the first factor, which is about the social mission and the sort of transformative nature, but trying to do what you can to not interfere with that initial first sale market as much as possible. It's not always perfect, but you're trying the best you can.
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback on that. Sorry, Kyle, I'm doing the thing again. Jumping you in the takeoff queue because we're running with the airplane analogies today. So a couple of different things. One, I think, to second everything that Aaron and Jason said, I think we tend to oversimplify things when we talk about DRM and TPM, because realistically they are, as Jason said, they're technologies. They do a lot of different things. You can use them for copy control, which is sort of the core initial vision of what DRM ended up being. They can also be mechanisms for restrictions on use, restrictions on downstream commerce. And the other things that I think we need to absolutely not lose sight of are licensing agreements, which are sometimes technologically enforced via DRM, TPM, sometimes not. But they are contracts that licensees writ broadly, must sign, again, writ very broadly, with, a contract ostensibly with the copyright holder. So EULA's terms of service, we're entering into tons of these contracts every day. There was a great, an art installation. It may have been at the MoMA, I don't recall, but somebody just printed out the terms of service of major, programs and just hung them on the wall to see comparatively how long they were. And they were like from the top of a 10-foot wall all the way down onto the floor in some cases. And I think the other thing is just good old fashioned market power, that we often lose sight of. At the end of the day, copyright is a government granted micro monopoly in a work. And government gets to set how big or small that micro monopoly reaches. So at the end of the day, if you are a cultural institution and you are no longer operating, strictly in the realm of buy physical book after first sale, lend physical book after first sale, if you're in a position where you have to engage in some kind of licensing negotiation, you have to think about the power imbalance there. You might have a big, like New York Public Library, Boston Public, Chicago Public, some major universities are going to have more leverage than others to be able to negotiate these things. We see this in academic publishing a lot, where you really do have something that comes closer to equitable bargaining power, but is still really not within spitting distance of it. There are situations like Amazon, for example. If you try to get an ebook published natively through Amazon's in-house imprint for its ebooks, they will not sell or license to libraries at any price under any conditions. They just refuse to deal. And because Amazon is the only place where you can legally acquire some books, some of which are in pretty high demand and written by big names, you're out of luck. So, there's a fundamental imbalance in bargaining power. And I think people really need to just, as we talk about, well, why aren't publishers working more with libraries when they do this? Why aren't they trying to? Because they don't have to. They don't have to. They've never had to, strictly speaking, and they've done it because it was an integral part of their business model and the distribution and reaching new readers. And now those incentives and the internal business decisions within publishers have shifted pretty dramatically. So we really do have a market that is deeply prejudiced against both consumers and public institutions, in favor of sort of, micro purchase kind of just direct control models.
I was happy to let you land that one, Meredith. Thank you. And so this comes down to something that I've been asking for the last couple of years. Like, when did libraries become the enemy? And I think that's kind of an interesting point to raise, is that, well, we may have lost some of what is perceived of as market value, or the business models has shifted outside of that. But to that, I say phooey, right? I say these systems have always coexisted, and they should coexist for purposes of long-term preservation and access that we're thinking about. I know Jason had to leave, but he was hinting at something that was interesting that I say, like, yes, copyright owners think about next fiscal quarter, right? Especially we're thinking about the next 100 years in libraries, right? And so if we can maintain that. So these two missions can coexist. And I would remind, there is some market power with libraries. I know lots of authors that do author talks at libraries. They are partners in libraries, in that not only will the book go there and be preserved there, also people may buy that book. There's a lot of research that says when people borrow books from libraries, they like them so much they go out and then seek them out for purchase. And that's some good data. There's a few articles on that. So we could solve some of this without DRM and without the technical savvy. And by the way, just to go on record, I don't love DRM, even though it's in the white paper. I was asked that on another panel. No, I have a glass slipper that I need to fit on a foot. And this is the current foot that I have, but I would like a new foot, or maybe even a new glass slipper. So functionally here, a lot of us have been thinking about how could we have a license contract that doesn't suppress libraries' mission, but also fulfills the business model. And I think that's capable of being done with terms that understand and value those two missions as distinct. Now I look at the open access movement, there's been some back and forth over that over the years, but not a lot of people got sued over non-exclusive open access licenses. But here we're seeing libraries sued. That's a big shift. And so that's of great concern to me. Obviously, the outcome of these particular lawsuits that are addressing controlled digital lending and addressing future preservation and access. So I am not in the camp of abolish all creation and abolish all the networks and stuff. Authors are going to sell books, users are going to write books, things are going to be produced, DVD, CD, streaming, etc. That's always going to happen. But let's create a legal system, and this is done through licensing, that respects and preserves library core values, which are reflected in the Copyright Act, right, under Section 108 and 109. But that will then ease the concern about a legal mechanism that's preventing us from doing our work. That's my, at least my thoughts on that initially.
And so if we can continue with the airplane analogies and bring us all home, one of the things that I'm hearing a lot, both seeing in the chat and also hearing from our panelists and from Jason, who unfortunately had to go, is the question of values, right? So there have been questions about, how can publishers and libraries work together to instill the values of that libraries hold of non-discriminatory open access to the public good. And that's one of the things that we're really trying to address with Library Futures. And I'm wondering if we could close out this really amazing hour from all of you talking about values, talking about how ownership and sort of the vagaries of ownership and libraries and the public interest can kind of come together and work together to start to solve some of these issues. Like what can be done?
That's another big question, Jenny. You've got
You all have 7 minutes. I'm just kidding. We can say a little long.
But so I could think of a few things that could be done, right? Let's go from the top of the let's change the whole Copyright Act to be reflective of the modern era, because we are looking back a lot. That's not going to work. Okay, maybe we make 109A digital first sale. We pass a law that fixes that. Those are way off statutory long-term policy stuff, subject to lots of things that I don't understand very well. That's why Meredith's here. But like locally at our libraries and our institutions, that we could deal with, again, advocating for the mission that, getting people to understand what libraries actually do, I think has been an interesting struggle the last few years, but especially during COVID. Why are we interested in first sale? Why are we interested in licensing terms that are more reflective of this? Why are we looking at market harm? Why are we looking at the 4 factors of fair use when we're making determinations about digitization? Because libraries are doing different things, because as the business of publishing has changed, libraries go along with that, right? I think it was Meredith that mentioned the printing press in England, right? And libraries were along that. Soon after that printing press law that came out in Statute of Anne, there was also a national deposit program that says, hey, make sure you put these books in these university libraries when you're done printing them. And so there's always been that relationship. And instead of for that relationship splintering, which I think it is certainly splintered with some lawsuits over the last decade or so, and most recently against Internet Archive, there could be a reimagining of that relationship that does not sacrifice the values that we have when we created the concept of libraries here, public free libraries loaning materials to those that couldn't afford it, which is fundamental core, right? That idea that this promotes literacy learning and engagement in a way that is valued by most Americans. You ask them if they like a library, most of them say yes. So how do we build off that spirit to come to that? So that was a lot of answers. Sorry.
So I would add to that just that it's worth thinking about connections between the specific sets of issues that, you know, libraries and other similar institutions are facing, and what might seem like disconnected and quite distinct issues that other communities are contending with. So Meredith earlier mentioned the right to repair movement. I've been thinking about the right to repair movement sort of nonstop for the last year, writing a new book that's hopefully going to be out by the end of this year. And, you know, there are some really important parallels to the challenges that libraries are facing, right? Very different attitudes and approaches and cultures in some ways, but I think the issues have a lot more in common than you might think. And the right to repair movement is, I think, slowly making progress on a fight that can and in some form eventually will be won. Part of what I think both of those sets of issues have in common is resisting a sort of increasing concentration of power in an ever dwindling number of hands, right? And that issue, at least from my perspective, is an incredibly broad cultural issue, right? We talk a big game about kind of sharp-elbowed competition in the United States, but it's like mostly rhetoric. It's not something that we actually practice. Companies buy up competitors, you know, to, you know, avoid future threats. Media companies are consolidating left and right. Politicians are gerrymandering their districts so they don't have to compete for voters. Kevin Durant, all of these things, right, show us that like competition is not the force that we thought it was. And instead, we're becoming more and more comfortable with the idea that a very small handful of companies and institutions have power over the rest of us. And I think once you put it in those terms, you can start to see the connections between these sorts of issues. And I think that makes for not only kind of practical alliances, but also a really useful kind of rhetorical tool. Part of the reason Jason and I wrote this book and sort of wrote it through the lens of ownership is because ownership like hits people in like the lizard brain, right? It appeals to people at a really kind of fundamental level that hopefully shifts their thinking and motivates some action. And so I think thinking about the rhetoric can be really important here too.
Yeah, I will say, and I am hopeful on this point, which is a thing I'm not usually. Hopeful is not usually a word I use in relationship to copyright policy. Having said that, you know, as somebody who spends a lot of time as a lobbyist, I am part of the problem. If you sort of look at the historical trajectory of how copyright law has made, you know, as I mentioned earlier, it's generally you keep the basic framework of what came before, and then you just tape more rights on. And historically, if you've never read Jessica Littman's book, Digital Copyright, highly recommend you go out and read. Everybody should read their Littman. And it does a great job of chronicling how in the 20th century, this tended to be a process of established industries doing pretty well for themselves. Upstart new industry technology of some variety comes in, like movies or talkies or the recording industry, upsets the apple cart, eats everybody's lunch. Everyone gets together around a table. They trade horses over the course of years or sometimes decades. They hash out a new copyright act. Things are fine for sometimes less than 18 months before the next upstart comes in, and the whole cycle just repeats again. And so the end result of this is historically copyright has almost always in the 20th century been seen as a fight between incumbent and upstart industries. And libraries were a part of it, but they weren't the motivating, you know, they weren't all honestly the motivating factor in a lot of cases. And consumers were just not even in the calculus for you know, basically up until modern day. That has started to change a lot with the online ecosystem. We are now constantly interacting with copyright law. We're constantly butting up against it in ways that are frankly absurd, sort of Kafka-esque, you know, behaviors that even lawmakers will acknowledge are pretty benign and sort of how you just expect people to use the internet, suddenly start butting up against these strictures of copyright law as traditionally interpreted. our entire conversation about software copyright and first sale. The fact we're having a fight about digital first sale is just absurd. So there has been the beginning stages of sort of a reckoning about this in a way that is very refreshing to me, because it keeps me employed, so I'm biased. But you suddenly have senators saying, like, actually, the way that copyright law is enforced on a practical level has very serious effects for people's ability to have their voices heard, to sell their own books, to make money, to monetize, to feed their families, to be able to connect to the internet in the first place. If we're talking about ISP disconnections under the DMCA, these have very real choices, and they're not just multi-billion-dollar industry one versus multi-billion industry two. And that has started to finally pick up some steam. And with that has come discussions about things like competition law, and how do we think about the concentration of, there's 3 major record labels, 4 music publishers, 4, maybe 3. I don't know if we're going from 5 to 4 or 4 to 3 major publishers, potentially with the Random House acquisition. And so now everybody's very aware of this. And I think because, unfortunately, it's taken the rubber really meeting the road for a lot of constituents for this to be taken seriously, but we are actually starting to see a sign of change there. So I am cautiously optimistic. It's not going to change overnight. If it changes over the course of my career, I will consider that to be a victory. But we are getting there. So, folks staying involved and staying informed and making good trouble is always a good way to move forward.
That is a wonderful way to end this conversation. I like to say that we're going to fight for our rights in the age of the end user licensing agreement. Thank you so much to everybody who has come, who has participated, to all the questions in the chat. If you don't feel like your question was answered, you can tweet at us at library_futures, and we will make sure that your question was answered. We're happy to answer. If you don't use Twitter, you can email us at info@libraryfutures.net. You can visit us on the internet, and we appreciate your time. Thank you again. We'll be having more events like this and other ways to get involved. And the best way to find out about all of that is to get on our mailing list, which you can do on our website. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great morning, afternoon, or evening, no matter what time it is. And thanks again to our panelists.